friends who were not present there. So only 2 words. Maria Rosa Antognazza, who is now our visiting professor, so to speak, virtually in Milan. She teaches at King's College, London. She is currently president, chair of the British Association in the history of philosophy, and president of the British Association of Philosophy of Religion. And she's a well-known scholar in history of philosophy, in particular early modern philosophy, and more especially Leibniz. She began her studies and research on Leibniz with a pioneering study on Leibniz's theology, philosophy, religion. And then some years ago, he published a biography, Leibniz, an intellectual biography, which is now considered so a reference work, a standard reference book for Leibniz's biography. And she also edited the Oxford Handbook on Leibniz. Today, Maria Rosa gives a lecture on the benefit to philosophy of the study of its history, and this is the title of a paper which was published, if I'm not mistaken, in 2015, and which was the occasion for a lively debate, especially in the English-speaking world. Actually, the topic of the relationship between history of philosophy and philosophy is, so to speak, a traditional one, or one which cyclically reproposes itself. It was notoriously debated in the Italian culture already in the 60s, or in French culture and so on. Maybe in the English-speaking philosophical milieu, of course, the situation, the starting point was different from ours. So the intervention of Maria Rosa raised the interest for the issue, and I think provides also us with a fresh look on this topic. And we invited Maria Rosa to tell about this because it seemed to us that it was a good topic to propose for a discussion given to the department, because it is something that could, in a way, where different academic skills and disciplines could and should have a dialogue. I think an interesting dialogue. So I give Maria Rosa the word and for her speech. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefano, for this generous introduction. I will, just point out that the handout for this paper is posted in the chat. So I hope you will be able also to download it if you want, and I will share my screen in a moment so we can follow together. Let me just say that if I were to go out of virtual existence for a moment, don't be alarmed, it happened before, and so far I always manage to come back to virtual existence after a couple of minutes. So if that happens, don't go away, hopefully I will be back, but let's hope it will not happen. And now I will try to share my screen. Hopefully this will work.
Well, Maria Rosa, it's the other way around. You were already sharing it. Now it's gone.
Oh, now it's gone.
No, it was shared before.
It was shared before, great.
Right.
Okay, let me see if, no, now it's not shared. Okay, let me try again. What about now? Okay.
Perfect. Perfect. Thanks.
Oh, great. For a moment,
Okay.
I feared that I couldn't do it again. Okay, the benefit to philosophy of the study of its history. Now, the first version of this paper was, I gave it at King's College London as my inaugural lecture at King's College London, because it has a sort of programmatic, if you like, character, and it is a way to make a case, especially to my colleague in the Anglo-American world, why there is a benefit to philosophy of the study of its history. So I will advance in this paper the view that the history of philosophy is both a kind of history and a kind of philosophy. As a kind of history, I claim it must meet the standards of any other serious historical research, including the use of the relevant linguistic and philological tools, and the study of the broader political, cultural, scientific, and religious contexts in which more strictly philosophical views developed. And this is covers some of my work in which I have tried to illuminate certain philosophical commitments of Leibniz by placing them in the broader, especially theological, but also scientific, cultural context. So the claim is that the history of philosophy must also be history in a serious, robust way. At the same time, the claim is that it's also a kind of philosophy. Its ultimate, and as a kind of philosophy, its ultimate aim is a substantive engagement with those very philosophical views. First, in striving to understand them on their own terms, and secondly, in probing and interrogating them as possible answers to central questions of enduring philosophical relevance. So let me stop for a moment there, because here there is a claim which needs some explanation. So the claim that there are central questions of enduring philosophical relevance. Not everybody will agree with this, and in fact there is an historicist views thinking that history would and should cure you of this very idea that there are enduring philosophical relevance. It should give you the idea that the problems are not the same. I don't agree with that, and I do think that there are problems which have enduring significance across times, across context. It might be a matter of learning the language and translating, but I think problems like the nature of what is ultimately real or the nature of knowledge have enduring philosophical relevance. This is different, I think, from not being alerted to the sense of contingency of the way in which certain problems are historically discussed. And indeed, as I will try to show with the second of my examples, I think the history of philosophy is particularly good in avoiding to mistake what is the result of historical contingencies or the result of cultural context, avoiding to mistake that for some kind of timeless universal truth. At the very least, as I will try to show with my second example, the history of philosophy is really an excellent tool for avoiding collapsing the latest mainstream orthodoxy, if not into an eternal truth, at least into the best explanation of full stop. So, having said that, I do think that there is a sort of philosophia perennis which runs through the history of philosophy and which in a certain way transcend also times and contexts. This thesis, which I am going to defend, that the history of philosophy is both a kind of history and a kind of philosophy, is also to be understood against a certain background. And this background is the background in which even nowadays, and maybe especially in the Anglo-American world, there are two approaches which are still, as it were, fighting with one another. And one is what is called the appropriation sort of approach, in which the idea is that it doesn't really matter who said what, or even if somebody really said something, but all that matters is the argument, the cogency. So it's fine to go back and just to mine one argument here and there, never mind if that is out of context, if that is not what a certain author intended to say, because what is important is just the cogency of that argument. So this is the appropriation approach. And the other one is the contextualist approach. So the idea that when one is doing history of philosophy, one is just catering for historical exactitude, and therefore one should avoid actually to try to do philosophy while you are doing that. Now, these two different approaches are not new. And if you like, one of the classic authors in which you find them is Russell. And you find that in his introduction to the philosophy of Leibniz, when Russell says that there are two sorts of objects for the history of philosophy. One is an historical object; it has to do with influences, with context, and the other one is a philosophical object, and it doesn't care about influences, context, and all that. It just cares about the intrinsic philosophical cogency of the great systems of philosophy. And Russell is quite clear that he is pursuing the second enterprise, and he really doesn't think that one, at least himself, he does not care about the first one. So against this backdrop, my claim is that no, these are two sides of the same coin. It's both a kind of history and a kind of philosophy. So I will try to argue for this thesis, not by presenting a new theoretical framework, but by presenting three case studies in which it seems to me that the engagement with the history of philosophy is clearly beneficial to philosophy itself. And these three examples will be the first from epistemology, the second from metaphysics, and the third from the historiography of philosophy itself. I will come to the conclusion that doing history of philosophy is a way to think outside the box of the latest philosophical orthodoxy. Somewhat paradoxically, far from imprisoning its students into the straitjacket of an outdated and crystallized view, I claim that the history of philosophy trains the mind to think differently and alternatively about the fundamental problems of philosophy. It keeps us alert to the fact that last is not always best, and that a genuinely new perspective often means embracing and developing an old insight. So that is what I now set out to illustrate by going to my three cases. And these three cases draw on my own experience, my own practice of doing history of philosophy. The first one is epistemology. How traditional is the traditional analysis of knowledge? And I think that perhaps the most salient example of the benefit to philosophy of a non-anachronistic engagement with its history comes from epistemology. And let me add here that this is as it were, a development and expansion of this section of my talk is actually my current research project, and is the book I am writing for OUP, and which I am hoping to have an opportunity to discuss in September when, Dio volente, I will be able, I hope, to come in person to Milan. So as it were, this is part of what I am doing, and it is also based on two papers, one which I have written together with Michael Ayers, and which is on knowledge and belief from Plato to Locke, and which is now published in the recent book by Michael Ayers on knowing and seeing. And the other paper where I discuss what I'm going to here just to summarize very briefly is a paper on the distinction in kind between knowledge and belief, which has appeared last year now in the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society. So we are frequently told, especially in the Anglo-American world in which I work, that on the traditional or standard understanding of knowledge, knowledge that P is at least approximately justified through belief. If you go to epistemology in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a kind of Bible for all philosophy students, that is the definition you find, that is the standard understanding of knowledge, justified through belief, or the traditional understanding of knowledge. So the story continues. Edmund Gettier, in a paper of 1963, blew a huge hole in this long tradition of thinking that knowledge is justified through belief, stretching back to Plato by exposing the fact that justified through belief is not sufficient for knowledge. If you are then familiar with post-Gettier epistemology, you will see that it has been the story of post-Gettier epistemology to look for the elusive fourth condition to add to justify through belief to arrive these not only necessary but also sufficient conditions of knowledge. And here is my question. How traditional is this traditional analysis of knowledge? If one returns to examining main figures and traditions in the history of philosophy, the standard analysis begins to look surprisingly non-standard. The traditional view, it appears, is not a tradition stretching back to the infancy of philosophy with Plato, the epistemic naivety of which was finally exposed in 1963 by Getty's short paper. Instead, it begins to look like a 20th century view, prominent especially in the Anglo-American world, which after the middle of the century has repeatedly tried and now, according to many, failed to correct itself. If one goes back to the history of philosophy, one finds instead a persistent and genuinely traditional strand of thought, according to which knowledge derives directly from its object, which is present in a primitive and irreducible way to the mind of the knower. That is, in different ways, knowledge is a primitive perception or irreducible mental seeing what is the case. Knowledge is a primitive present of what is, to on in Plato, to the mind, or to, depending whether you are or are not an empiricist, also to the senses, in which there is no gap between a knower and known. Belief, on the contrary, is a different mental state, is a mental state of cognitive mode in which precisely the perception or presence which characterizes knowledge is lacking, and assent to the object of cognition is given, rightly or wrongly, on grounds external to the object itself. If you like, we can then go into some example of that. The grounds for believing may be very strong, and belief can be true and strongly justified, and still on this traditional account, such a belief would not be knowledge, but a different mental state or cognitive mode, which cannot be turned into knowledge without stopping to be, strictly speaking, belief. So I think much traditional epistemology would have certainly agreed that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge, but not because something else should be added to true justified belief, but because knowledge and belief are different in kind. And I think you find this in Plato. Far from being the father of the justified true belief analysis, it seems to me that Plato is very clear that there is a distinction in kind between episteme and doxa, between nous and doxa. Knowledge is not a species, so episteme is not a species of doxa. Knowledge is not a species of belief which meets certain criteria. Belief and knowledge, on the other hand, can both be conceived as two different ways of thinking with assent. And here for me, an important inspiration is provided by Aquinas, and by the way in which in Aquinas' view are really captured a number of views which were there in the tradition, both coming from Plato and coming from Aristotle. I will read out these two quotations from Aquinas because I think they are particularly good in summarizing this tradition, which I think should be recovered. Now, the intellect assented to something in two ways. One way, because it is moved to assent by the object itself, at ipso objecto, which is known either to itself, as in the case of first principles, of which there is understanding, intellectus, or through something else already known, as in the case of conclusions, of which there is knowledge, scientia. In another way, the intellect assents to something, not because it is sufficiently moved to this assent by its proper object, so there is not this present of its proper object as in intellectus or in scientia, in which your assent is moved by seeing it. So it, in another way, the intellect assents to something, not because it is sufficiently moved to this assent by its proper object, but through a certain voluntary choice, turning toward one side rather than the other. And if this is done with doubt or fear of the opposite side, there will be opinion. If, on the other hand, this is done with a certainty and without such fear, there will be faith, fides. So fides is not on the side of the intellectus or the scientia, is on the side of credere, which is a different cognitive mode, is a different way to assent to the object of cognition, because the object of cognition is not directly present. Now, those things are said to be seen, videri dicuntur, which by themselves move our intellect or the senses to knowledge of them. Wherefore, it is evident, manifestum est, that neither faith nor opinion can be of things seen, either by the senses or by the intellect. And in this other quotation, Aquinas is putting the same point more succinctly. The reason why the same thing cannot simultaneously and in the same respect to be known and believed, so these are two mutually exclusive mental states, is that what is known is seen, whereas what is believed is not seen. Okay, now Aquinas may be accused of many things, but amongst these is not wishing to undermine belief or religious belief in particular. What he's saying is that we have to acknowledge that there are different cognitive modes. One is the cognitive mode of the intellect, the understanding in which you see something, a truth, an intelligible truth, for instance, and scientia. And another one in which the object of cognition, for instance, in the case of the nature of God, let's say, is not directly present, and you have to assent to it for reasons, good reasons, which are external to the object itself. Now, interesting enough, in an author who is in many ways very different from Aquinas, Locke, one finds the same sort of relationship between knowing and believing. And there are even passages which are really strikingly similar on this. Perceiving some truth or thing is not a matter of varying justification for a belief. It is not the presence or absence of firm assent which distinguishes knowledge from belief. One could have a very high degree of assent also in belief, but the presence or absence of clear sight, manifesta visio, of the object of cognition, the presence or absence of direct cognitive contact with what is. To conclude, a number of epistemologists have now come to the conclusion that the analysis of knowledge as a belief plus the addition of some conditions does not work. A case in point is Timothy Williamson, Knowledge First Epistemology, which where I am is now really taking the world by storm, which is precisely pushing back on this and saying, no, knowledge is not belief, plus the addition of some conditions. Perhaps this is why, historically, the traditional accounts of knowledge central to Western philosophy did not take knowledge to be a kind of belief which meets certain criteria. So it seems to me that that was not the traditional way to think of it, and there have been work done on ancient philosophy in particular, pushing back on the idea that Plato should be read in that way. So what happened is that there was this, in the 20th century, mid-20th century, this conception took hold, and people glance back at the past and say, well, let's see if there is some rudimentary version of that in the past. We propose, and I mean myself and my colleagues, that something like the earlier, genuinely traditional conception of knowledge and its relation to belief, purged of some unacceptable elements, constitutes a fruitful alternative to the project of identifying the criteria that belief must satisfy in order to be knowledge. So for today's purposes, for this talk purpose, what I wanted to stress is that far from displaying epistemic naivety, the history of philosophy displays a genuine insight which may help setting back on the right track 21st century epistemology. So this was my first example, which, as I said, is, as it were, was the starting point of the project I am pursuing now. The second example is from metaphysics and thinking about matter. So those who came to the seminar on Leibniz will recognize here my paper, or part of the claims in my paper on primary matter. So what is matter? Many people will probably reply that it is roughly the stuff which we experience as extended and as offering some degree of resistance of which physical objects are made up. This common sense pre-theoretical picture was a plausible approximation in the fairly immediately intelligible world of mechanistic physics. However, the strange world of modern physics makes it much more inaccurate to think of physical objects or bodies as ultimately made up of the extended stuff that we experience. Once you go into quantum physics and theory of relativity and so on, you don't find this stuff, this extended stuff anymore. One could even argue that modern physics has no use for the concept of matter in its technical work. We need to turn, therefore, to philosophy in order to probe our pre-theoretical understanding of matter and determine the role that the concept of matter may play in an inquiry into what is ultimately real. If one turns specifically to the history of philosophy, one finds ways of explaining what matter is, which challenge assumptions, expose the problems of prima facie satisfactory accounts, and force us to consider unfamiliar and yet powerful possible alternatives. In a nutshell, one of the things the history of philosophy does is keeping the mind open to alternative perspectives as well as resistant to settling easily for commonly held views or common sense beliefs. For instance, Leibniz is a prime example of that. Leibniz, as I have argued in my paper on primary matter, moves away from the broadly Aristotelian framework of primary substances as composites of two ontological constituents, form and matter, of which matter is the ultimate subject of inherence. Leibniz moves away from that toward a more frankly Neoplatonic, or more precisely Plotinian framework, in which matter is identified with non-being. Far from being what is ultimately real, is identified with non-being. Matter is merely a way to express the negation of some further perfection. Matter is just a noun, a way to describe the necessary limitation of the active power or force which constitutes created simple substances or monads. It is not a positive constituent which must be added to force in order to have a substance. And here you will recognize my one of my favorite quotations: the matter of things is nothing that is limitation. Materia rerum est nihilum. Now, my aim here is not to argue that Leibniz was right. Rather, I wish simply to note that Leibniz's proposal constitutes one of a handful of genuinely alternative ways of thinking about matter, arriving at the conclusion that what is ultimately real is not a standard stuff, but active powers or forces. This metaphysical model challenges more immediately intuitive accounts. If nothing else, it exposes the problems that such accounts will have to face if they wish to maintain their claim of being the best on the market. So I draw here a lesson for the history of philosophy. I take the view that the history of philosophy does not so much present us with settled conclusions as with alternative models of explanation. So I am, as an historian of philosophy, I am always suspicious when somebody says, well, after Kant, nobody can say, so here there are Kant's specialists, but I use Kant as a typical author, so who is mentioned in this contest. Well, after Kant, nobody can propose such and such. And my reaction is, well, wait 100 years, and then we will say. Because as it happens, for instance, now there is a very strong anti-Kantian push back towards a more Aristotelian view of things, direct realism, and so on. And one can still be a Kantian and say that's wrong, but it is certainly not the case that after Kantian, that was it. These are alternative models of explanation. It alerts us to the possibility of looking at things from a completely different angle. An angle which might be orthogonal to our present day perspective, and which is capable of turning the whole picture upside down, showing that there is a competing and yet coherent way to see what is in front of us. So students of the history of philosophy are therefore continuously challenged to make up their own minds and never to take for granted the latest mainstream consensus. Being the latest mainstream consensus is not a particularly good reason to take it to be right. One has to make up her own or his own mind. there are alternative models. The history of philosophy is, in short, an excellent antidote to the constant temptation of intellectual dogmatism. I come now to my last example, historiography, philosophy and theological commitments, science and religion. Now, I think philosophy has been slower than other disciplines in revising its appreciation of the role of theological commitments in the development of early modern systems of thought, for instance. Why it has been slower? Well, one reason, I think, is especially in the Anglo-American world, is this persistent tendency toward anachronism, which became even more acute with analytical philosophy, which in its early days was even militantly anti-historical or ahistorical. Now that has changed, not least because also the history, also analytical philosophy now has a history, and people have to realize that if you are speaking about Frege or Russell, now you are speaking of the history of certain views, but still, I think there is work to be done, and in other fields, especially the history of science, these scholars have been much more on their feet and prompt in recognizing the importance, for instance, of theological commitments in the development of early modern systems of thought. And here you have Niccolò Guicciardini, who is a world-leading authority on all this, and well, if we take Newton, for instance, that is a very good case in point. But there are other examples. The work of Charles Webster, for instance, has been really groundbreaking in all this. But let's say now we have taken on board that is an important part of philosophy to have this sub-discipline, which is the history of philosophy, which has its own role to play. And let's say that now we take on board that also the non-strictly philosophical commitments should be taken into account. But even if we take on board all that, one could still argue that non-strictly, one could still wonder, if you like, whether taking into account non-strictly philosophical commitment really matters in philosophy. One could still say, well, what ultimately matters in philosophy is the quality and cogency of the arguments, not whether they were put forward by this or that person in this or that form. So that is really not what is at stake. Well, I think that this view overlooks the fact that the quality and cogency of the arguments is much more likely to be uncovered if one pays close attention to the way in which extraordinarily penetrating minds really presented these arguments, as well as to the contexts which implicitly fill the premises of what are often antimametic arguments. So it seems to me that the temptation of creating straw man and then say, oh, Descartes made this and that mistake, Locke made this and that mistake, Plato this and, well, if that is a straw man, well, you can put the label Descartes, Locke, as there is, for instance, nowadays a particularly fashionable label in epistemology is the so-called Lockean thesis. Well, then it's easy then to knock down a straw man. But if you look at what really the arguments were, well, these people are not likely just to commit easy fallacy and things like that. So I think there is something to be gained for understanding the quality and cogency of the arguments in really paying attention to what these people really said. And in order to understand that, you have to take into account the language, the context, what was the philosophical conversation, which may well be very different from our philosophical conversation. So I think that superior minds are few and far between, and there is a great deal to be gained from listening to what they actually taught. By the same token, there is a great deal that philosophy can gain in terms of refining and advancing its argument from really listening to its history. So I come now to my conclusion. The first example from epistemology shows, amongst other things, that the genuine insights of historical authors can be overlooked or distorted if approached anachronistically by projecting present-day views onto the past. Past authors sometimes taught in ways which are genuinely different from those in which we have come to think of a problem. And this difference, the very fact that it is different, and they don't think like us, may alert us to the alternative and fruitful ways of approaching the problem. As the second example tries to show, one encounters, for instance, coherent but competing metaphysical models which turn each other upside down. You can have, as I have been discussing repeatedly, two alternatives, for instance, a top-down order of explanation or a bottom-up order of explanation. And depending on which model you go for, a lot of things will change. While one fundamental alternative may have a more intuitive appeal for some of us than for others, may well ultimately depend on our pre-theoretical or not strictly philosophical commitments. So it could well be that a top-down order of explanation just doesn't resonate with you, and that you naturally gravitate toward a bottom-up order of explanation. And why? Because the top-down order of explanation will explain things which doesn't matter to you, you don't care about, and the bottom-up order of explanation will do that for you, or the other way around. The bottom-up just doesn't capture things which for you are, as it were, non-negotiable. You could lose something else in the philosophical explanation, but not that. Otherwise, all the rest doesn't make sense anymore. That is, there are what resonate with you may well depend on some pre-theoretical commitments that on what seems initially right or non-negotiable to us, and which then we set about to investigate and to test as rationally, rigorously, and prejudice-free as we can. It could well be that you start from a bottom-up approach, because that is what resonates with you. You investigate that, you interrogate that, and then you have to give up and say, no, actually, I have to switch. And the other way around can happen to the top-down theorist. You will start with that, thinking that will explain, and then you have to give up and to say, no, actually, once I look into it rigorously, rationally, prejudice-free, I have to conclude that that does not explain what really matters. This is why, as I try to show with my third example, it is often essential to take into account such broader intellectual commitments in order to fully appreciate the philosophical reasoning of other people, including historical authors. The upshot is that the study of the history of philosophy has an innovative and, I would say, subversive potential. It trains the mind to think alternatively about the problems of enduring philosophical relevance and to remain alert to the danger of intellectual dogmatism of the latest orthodoxy. This is not to say that the challenge to a current orthodoxy should always result in its rejection. There is nothing wrong in principle with ending up even more convinced by the current orthodoxy or never being shaken from one's endorsement of a current view. The point is rather that the history of philosophy helps to avoid taking current orthodoxy for granted. It seems to me that resisting the uncritical endorsement of whatever view, including prevailing views, is one of the key aims of philosophical thinking. Insofar as the history of philosophy contributes in a distinctive way to the forging of critical independence, it contributes to the aims of philosophy as such. Once again, this is not to claim that critical independence can be achieved only through the history of philosophy or is best achieved through the history of philosophy. My claim is more modestly that the history of philosophy contributes in a distinctive and significant way to achieving these goals. Indeed, it often deals with the history of paradigm shifting thinking by extraordinary minds who thought outside the box. Often when one does only, as it were, constructed philosophy, discussing in just as it were, contemporary register, what happens is that there is a lot of what Kuhn would have called normal science. If you look at the mainstream journals, there is a lot of normal science that just working inside the paradigm and explaining it better and so on. Well, in the history of philosophy is an history of shifting the paradigms, being confronted with vastly different views and alternative ways of thinking. So there is a great deal to be gained by continuing to engage in this long, broad, and deep conversation, to benefit from its insights, to avoid the pitfalls which have already been exposed, stopping, as it were, reinventing the wheel all the time, and take forward the journey of philosophy to the next stage of novel perspectives. So that was it. I stopped sharing, and so this is my pitch for the history of philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Rosa, for this brilliant and stimulating presentation. And for now on, I propose to the colleague of recruiting Maria Rosa for preparing a clip for the presentation of our curriculum of history in history of philosophy for our master. No, I say seriously, because anyway, I think that there are many questions or reactions to this fascinating exposition. So please.
So shall I suggest that we follow the same method we followed for the seminar, the doctoral seminar, and that is that you write in the chat Q or C just to announce that you have a comment or a question. And if you have a follow-up on what somebody asked or offered as a comment directly related, you write finger. And this will give me the order in which people have, as it were, announced themselves. Remember also that finger trumps hand, but there is no abuse of fingers as a way to jump the queue.
Yeah.
Okay, so I look forward to what you think of these. Maybe in Italy it's not as acute as it is when you work in an Anglo-American context. So let me see, sorry, I should go down to. Okay, so Maria Regina has a question.
When I read your beautiful some years ago, I really gained benefit. I am in theoretical philosophy actually, so maybe my perspective is a little bit different. But I am currently working on Peirce manuscripts, so in a way, of course, I am doing history of philosophy as well. So I am really like with you when you talk about this, the importance of showing alternatives to the tendency of anachronism or intellectual dogmatism. But the more I study my philosophers, such as Peirce, the more I have a question that maybe is just, what do you think is the role and the relevance of interpretation in the history of philosophy? I am asking the question because I see many times that when I study Peirce and he refers to other authors of the history of philosophy, then I go to those authors and study them, and obviously there are always discrepancies. Okay, so there is a high degree of interpretation in the way philosophers read the history of philosophy, like a Matryoshka game. Okay. And so what I think is that, of course, in philosophy, in other philosophers at least, there is a very important role of interpretation. And sometimes I am stuck because I study Peirce, who study other authors, who as well have studied other authors and even lived in different contexts, etc., etc., etc. So it's like a recursive history of philosophy. I don't know what to say. And so here is my question: what is this role of interpretation? Also, this is maybe more provocative in a way. I am thinking, for instance, to Descartes. Of course, pragmatism is one of the many tendency in contemporary, I mean, in the 20th century philosophy, went against Descartes in a way. And sometimes I ask myself, to what extent is Descartes' thought really what Descartes said, and not what the other saw in Descartes' writings?
So this is a wonderful question, and really it opens up a huge set of issues. I would say this. There are certain things which are just anachronistic, certain interpretations. Take Russell damning judgment of Leibniz monadology. Russell said, well, this is just a fairy tale. This is fantastic, a fairy tale. And I think that case is just, there are cases in which one is just not paying enough attention to what the way in which certain claims interacts with other claims, is not paying enough attention to the worldview of a certain author, and therefore what seems to you completely crazy, the monads, what is that supposed to be, is just a fairy tale. In fact, one misses some important aspect. So let's put that to one side. That is a case in which we do need to pay attention to the context of the thought, the language, the way in which people were presenting certain doctrines. Even so, there are genuine interpretative differences. And I think that is not so much to do specifically, at least the way I think of it, not so much specifically to do with the history of philosophy, although that makes it more acute, because you have also to bridge this gap between your time and that time, your language and that language, a certain forma mentis, which is no longer this one. But I think the problem of interpretation is equally present if you are discussing Timothy Williamson. So I see that all the time. You go to conferences and people are just are there fighting with each other, interpreting what this means and what the consequences of that are. And depending on how you interpret the coherence or lack of coherence of a set of claims, you will draw certain consequences. And I think that is an aspect which we find also when contemporary authors are talking to each other, Leibniz being another case in point, when he's discussing to the boss or with Bale, all the time saying, Mr. Bale doesn't quite get it. I told him already, I wrote to him, and still he doesn't get it. So, and they were contemporary authors, so they were in the same, but clearly Bale was interpreted things in a different way, Leibniz was interpreted in another way, and this is, as it were, again, this broader worldview, which then also shape the way in which we are interpreting certain claims. So I think it's a more general issue, and myself, when I am, for instance, in my current project, presenting my own interpretation of how the history of epistemology went, and the distinction in kind between knowledge and belief, other historians of philosophy which are equally serious or more, and equally knowledgeable or much more, will disagree on certain interpretation of one author and the other. But I think this is part also not only of contemporary conversation, but also of history more generally, because it's not that there is some objective historical fact to be there, to be discovered if only we discovered it. But also history is made of interpretation of what was really going on in Nazi Germany, what was really going on in the First World War, what were the causes. And it's not that, well, if you were living back then, you would have seen all the causes one in front of the other, because otherwise nowadays we would know what is going on in the British government, and still we don't know. You lack access to a number of things, and you will never have access to all that, and therefore it's also a matter of interpretation. So I think interpretation is a factor of life, is a fact of interpersonal relationship, which goes both synchronically and diachronically. So thank you very much. That is indeed a huge issue. So I have here Owen, JC. I don't know. Owen is your. JC
Owen is my first name, and JC is my second name. My initials, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I just wanted to thank you for the paper. I really enjoyed it, and I found myself really wholeheartedly agreeing with, I think, every claim and suggestion you made, with one possible exception, which I'd like to ask you about. And I'm at the University of Chicago in the theology department of the Divinity School, but I'm actually very lucky because although the philosophy department which I have more involvement with in some ways than the theology, is quite analytic in outlook and register and so on, method, you could say. They're also very historically inclined. And so a lot of their thinking, like in analytic philosophy, is done through the history of philosophy. And yeah, I have more respect for the analytic approach since going to Chicago than I had before, I have to say. But so my question
is
sorry.
Michael Kramer, I think, is there.
Michael Kramer is there, yeah, and Jim Conant is extremely interesting philosopher, and yeah.
On Ryle, Gilbert Ryle, for instance. Very good example of that. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Yeah. And so my question was, or the thing I was wondering about that maybe I disagree with is the idea of there being a philosophia perennis. And basically, it seems to me like something that Alistair MacIntyre claimed about ethical or moral philosophy or thinking it might be possible to extend his arguments quite unproblematically to metaphysics and epistemology also. And so, the first case study that you gave about epistemology, it seems to me like something, the moment at which it became kind of obvious that, of course, what the entire tradition was talking about was justified true belief and not some kind of immediate contact with beings, is like something that, like a historical shift where something perhaps was changed or maybe even broken comprehensively. And so what we're left with is a kind of a fragmentation of, we received the history of philosophy as fragments in some way, from which we're cut off. We have a very different perspective, and one of the, perhaps a perspectivalism is kind of more the difference rather than having any given perspective. And one of the the things that I think the Enlightenment with its search for certainty and ultimately Kant were responding to was, some things were the discovery of the New World, the historical consciousness arising, the Reformation, relativizing Christian beliefs, and so on. And all of these things contribute to a kind of, basically a relativization of values, beliefs, and knowledge, more than beliefs even. So I just wonder if you could just, I don't have a very particular focused question, but I just love if you could just reflect on, the fact that we're in modernity. Is there a particular philosopher of the past whose relationship to the history of philosophy you yourself identify with, like maybe a Pico della Mirandola, maybe not that strong, but something, just so that's the question, and you can answer as you like.
This is a wonderful question, really wonderful, and it gives me an opportunity to explain a bit more what I meant by philosophia perennis. I mean, I certainly didn't mean that there are not changes or even a moment of a break in the history of philosophy, which takes things in a different direction. So I certainly think that is the case. A case in point, for instance, is what happened with Hume in the early modern period. Hume proposes a certain way of thinking of things, which then really inform an whole huge strand of the history of philosophy. So I completely agree with that. And I also think that the way in which certain problems are approached is very different depending on the time, because for instance, in the medieval period, people were generally interested about the nature of angels, and nowadays that is not something that immediately resonates in the same way. However, when it comes to the nature of angels, although nowadays people will not maybe write a treatise on angelology as such, that problem was capturing something which is still discussed nowadays. how it will be if there are created but disembodied beings. What would that mean for the ontology and all that? So that is the philosophia perennis I am talking about. There are certain, I take the view that in philosophy, and especially in metaphysics, but also in the epistemology, there are only a handful of genuine alternatives. Either you are a monist or you are a pluralist. Either you are a top-down or you are a bottom-up. Now, having said that, take bottom-down, top-down. That could mean very different things. It could mean Plato, it could mean Spinoza, it could mean Leibniz, it could mean Hegel. Very different. And one could not say, well, Leibniz is the same as Plato, or Hegel is the same as Spinoza. But what I am saying is that there are certain fundamental alternatives which shape the way in which you are going to go. And then I think I agree with you that there are genuine breaks in the history of philosophy, that an whole set of things comes together to change that direction in the early modern world. An obvious thing which happened was modern science, and the way in which that changed the way in which things were approached, the new quantitative approach, experimental approach versus the qualitative approach. And that explains, well, contribute to the explanation why a certain bottom-up approach suddenly becomes more appealing to a number of people. So no, I agree with you, and my philosophia perennis is really not meant to say that there is some kind of eternal truth which remains the same going through the history of philosophy. Having said that, for instance, when it comes to justified true belief, I do think that that is a 20th century orthodoxy. And funnily enough, there has been a paper in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy written after I published my paper on the benefits to philosophy, and drawing on my paper and saying, actually, even in the 20th century, when you start looking deeper, who really thought that knowledge is justified to belief, you are going to struggle to find something which really says that in terminis, as opposed to being in the ballpark. So that is just a parenthesis to say that I do think that was more like a blip in that extreme form in which it has then been taken up by post-Gettier epistemology. But there is another sense in which that was not a blip at all. And the sense is this: I take the view, I have argued for that in my paper on the distinction in kind between knowledge and belief, that the JTB plus analysis of knowledge are ultimately the offspring of a skeptic outlook. So the idea that everything is belief, and then that comes in different degrees of justification. The question is, can we really ever bridge this gap, as opposed to having a direct contact with reality? We form certain beliefs, things as they appear to us, and then we have to find justification to see whether the way they appear is really the way things are. Now, if you go back in the ancient philosophy, it seems to me that that was a debate which was already going on between Plato and skepticism. Skeptics are agreeing in a sense with Plato that yes, there is a distinction between appearances and reality. The difference is that for them we have access only to appearances, whereas Plato thought that we can also access the forms of what is. So it seems to me that in that extreme form of the Gettier problem is a 20th century blip, but in its backbone is not at all a blip, is a current which goes throughout the history of philosophy. Is really the millennia-old debate between a skeptical and a non-skeptical philosophy of cognition. And this is, I think, an illustration of what I was trying to say. There are certain things that in different incarnation, they appear again and again throughout the history of philosophy. But then in certain period, they take a distinctive, different shape, because, for instance, analytic philosophy seems to suggest that a good way to get to grip to knowledge is to analyze it. If we can go back, get down to its basic elements and so on. So that is the way in which I read this Philosophia Perennis. I hope that is...
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful question. Okay, I have now two Stefani. The first one is Bacin and then Stefano Di Bella.
Well, thanks again, Maria Rosa. It was very, very helpful and very, very clear, as usual. First, I would like to point out how things seem to have changed lately. Since, I mean, on the one hand, you suggest that the history of philosophy is primarily helpful for its innovative potential. And then I read in Tim Willison's last book that the more we understand philosophy as a revolutionary discipline, the larger the role for the history of philosophy. So the gap seems now rather, well, bridged, at least in a large part. So it's really interesting to see how these different takes on philosophy and the history of philosophy are sort of coming together. But my main point, or my main question is a different one, rather related to the one you just discussed. I'm extremely sympathetic with everything you just said and wrote in your paper. But of course, this criterion of the enduring philosophical relevance poses lots of problems for potential opponents of your view, of course. If only because, as you just mentioned, if only because of the many shifts in, well, in what exactly philosophy was thought to be at different stages of its history, of course. And I would have thought that this is where the benefit well, this is where philosophy benefits the history of philosophy, namely in giving some orientation, some take on contemporary discussions, not contemporary problems, of course, because we are not interested in those only, but in contemporary discussion. So I would say that gives you the contemporary drive, or the actual drive for the history of philosophy. And then you can also see, I mean, it's not only an abstract definition, you can also see many good examples in the recent decades. I mean, just to give a different case than those you already mentioned, the history of ethics. I mean, the great rise in interest for the history of ethics in the last 3 or 4 decades was very steep and very, very large, very pervasive in the Anglophone world. But interestingly, after, well, philosophical drives, after Rawls, after Anscombe, after Bernard Williams. So then we could also say probably something more, well, more positive, more optimistic even for the role that philosophy plays for the history of philosophy. But I'm not sure you could agree on that.
I agree 100%. I think that is a wonderful way to put it. And I completely agree that there is also a benefit of philosophy to the history of philosophy, exactly in the way you were putting it. And I tried to capture that, but by saying that ultimately the history of philosophy needs to be a kind of philosophy. So to be interested in those very problems, which are philosophical problems. And I think the contemporary debate and our colleagues who do not specialize in the history of philosophy help us with that, to resist the temptation to go down the rabbit hole of pure antiquarianism, of pure establishing some minor point of details. I think it is very important, at least the way I see it, to keep alive why does it matter? Why is this interesting philosophically? Why does that contribute to what I was calling the enduring philosophical interest? So I see your point as reinforcing the idea that precisely because there are problems of enduring philosophical relevance, we should listen to the debate of nowadays, see what matters to people nowadays, and then see how were these problems ethics, the comeback of virtue ethics. They were discussed in the past, and here you find that Aristotle is actually helping us with that. So yeah, I agree 100%, and I think that is a very nice way to put it, that there is also a benefit to the history of philosophy coming from philosophy itself. And if I can also give a sort of biographical detail here, I have found, quite to my surprise, going around giving this paper in various contests, that the most sympathetic reactions often came precisely from non-historians of philosophy. People say, well, that's good. Yeah, now I understand why it is a good thing to study the history of philosophy, because that is stuff which matters. I didn't quite see it from that point of view. And to me, that was very, very interesting. And I take it is part of that these are problems which matters to people nowadays. That is what contemporary philosophers are discussing. And we as historians of philosophy can, as it were, make available broader toolkits and broader explanatory models, being guided by these wonderful people who have been discussing this before us. So thank you very much for that. Stefano Di Bella.
Yes, but maybe I could also give up my question, because I think that I could only reinforce what you have said in the last exchange, because maybe it's not by chance if you, Maria Rosa, in your talk you have emphasized the benefit of the history of philosophy. Your talk, which arises from a confrontation, a direct confrontation with the Anglo-American context and the analytical context, whereas for us, who, and in a way, were educated in a different cultural background, also the tradition of historicism, etc. We still have feel the importance, the need of emphasizing also the other aspect, the other way. Also now the pendulum is also in Italy, and so a bit changed. No, so I also think I also sympathize with your approach. And in a way, we can say there can be no good history of philosophy, to paraphrase a well-known dictum, no history of philosophy without a philosophical problem. Okay, I remember a small episode, another example. Ettore Casari, who was a great logician, but also a person with a relevant historical sensitivity and culture, illustrated an example, the fact that in Aristotle's Topics, there are some pages which were so neglected, but or considered as something not very interesting. But he showed that one could draw from there a fragment, a significant fragment of a logic of relations. So, and if you don't have this sensitivity, this perception of the theoretical matter at stake, you could not understand maybe Aristotle text. On the other hand, there is the danger of anachronism, as you said, and so we have to move to the text and to the order with some problem, and so some agenda, some framework, conceptual framework. But on the other hand, we are we cannot force the author and the text according to our present day agenda. For instance, another example, our Leibniz is usually understood in terms of, or interpreted, many problems in Leibniz in terms of possible worlds and so on. And actually, a lot of things have been discovered in Leibniz because of there was in present day philosophy an interest in some fields of logic and so on. But at the same time, also Leibniz actually was a logician, was the grandfather of possible worlds, But I think that, I don't know if you agree, also interpreting the modal philosophy of Leibniz in terms of our possible world semantics is misleading, is to a certain extent misleading. So I think there is, it is a dialectic which cannot be avoided and should not be avoided. Maybe it's the classical problem exactly of interpretation, the first question. So we must have something common with the other in order to understand it, but at the same time we should preserve the other in its original, exactly in order to be useful, also theoretically for us. It is important to preserve it in its original, in its irreducibility to our paradigms. So I don't know, it's a reflection more than a reaction, more than a precise question, but.
No, I agree. And I think, as you put it, it is really dialectic between these two. And it is a continuous challenge because no matter as one is trying to not to be anachronistic, even if one is a bona fide historian of philosophy, there is always a risk of sliding into that. I certainly see what you are saying, that certain, and what was saying also Stefano before, the other Stefano before, that certain debate in contemporary philosophy have driven the rediscovery of certain parts of our own philosophy, or they are really guiding us in understanding the significance of what certain parts of these philosophers were about. And yeah, I think it is generally a conversation between these two, and that it has to be two sides of the same coin. And so the two approaches, either you do it or you do philosophy, I don't think that really work. Also from the point of view of the historian of philosophy, so it's not just that I am saying, oh, the analytic philosophy don't realize this and that. We as historians of philosophy also sometimes in important ways don't understand what matters, how we should approach a certain test, interrogate a certain test which really speaks to problems which are alive for people. I think myself that's very important. Why it matters. I have here, thank you very much, Stefano. I have here Stella with a raised hand. Yes. And Roberto, hi Roberto, I wanted to say hello before, who has written here in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Stella.
Okay. I just wanted to make a short comment based on my personal experience. I graduated here in Rome at the University La Sapienza, and I always found that it was kind of obvious to have an historical approach to philosophy. And then for my thesis, I decided to work in the neuroethics field, which is an emerging field in the last 2 decades. And then I realized how much history of philosophy is important, because what I observed is that in an emerging field such as neuroethics, without considering what the authors said in the past, it seems to me that there is no philosophy at all, because it seems like people are just collecting data and they don't really know how to interpret them. And so that is also why I decided to change my curriculum here in Milan, and I came back to a more historical approach, because I felt that there was something missing in their thoughts, in other philosopher thoughts. And what I wanted to say is that it seems to me that history of philosophy is important to shape the new emerging fields. We can, be stronger knowing what other authors said in the past. And I don't know, I think it is really important, because in neuroethics, sometimes they are just saying nothing, they just observe a lot of data that are in contrast, and they don't really know what to say in the end. So
yeah, no, I agree, and is a very nice example that you are giving. And I myself, I see it many times, because I was myself educated in the Italian system. So I came from this tradition in which to do philosophy is to do history of philosophy, at least in my time. That is what you did. You started in secondary school to go to that, and then you go to university, you do that again systematically, and so on. And even if you do theoretical philosophy, it has always this very strong underpinning. But I was surprised when I went, I moved to the Anglo-American world, to Scotland first and England. I was really surprised that the history of philosophy is basically never studied systematically. So basically you have, for instance, even in places which do history of philosophy, You have Descartes, Hume, and maybe that's it. And then maybe Kant, if you are advanced. And that gives you a completely different approach. I think that is changing. I see it changing all the time. I was just yesterday attending a wonderful paper by a colleague of mine who works in philosophy of perception, works in philosophy of mind, and he was drawing on Husserl. When I first started Husserl, people didn't even know who it was, or certainly people didn't think it was something to take seriously. Hegel was considered a kind of poet and a bad one at that, but not somebody you could really engage with. And this is changing. This is changing because if you see what Brandon is doing and all that that bunch of people in Pittsburgh, it is changing. And yeah, I think for younger philosophers and historian of philosophy is a very exciting moment. And I think people coming from the, call it continental tradition, Italian tradition, German tradition, have something really precious that they can contribute when they interact with the Anglo-American world, because people being educated in Italy, they come with this deep, not as it were caricature-like understanding of certain figures, which proves very fruitful if you then engage in more theoretical work. And again, I have seen that many times. People who come, for instance, to King's College London for open competitions, and they ended up beating the person coming from Oxford. And why? Because they really know their Aristotle, they really know their Stoics, and when they do logic, they really understand all that, not just the last round of this discussion. So I think there is something that our tradition really has to contribute. I think, if I may say so, our tradition has to be careful not to do the opposite mistake, losing sight of why it matters, going down the purely antiquarian route, because then is what really block all conversation in a more international philosophical conversation. But for instance, for Leibniz, if you have really done your Scotus, your Occam, your Aquinas, you will see things in Leibniz that other people who maybe have been educated in big schools in the US, but don't really deal with Latin, don't let alone with Greek, they just will not see it. They simply will not see it. And so one can go there and contribute to something which is very enriching from both tradition. And I think the Anglo-American tradition at the same time contribute to something which is from which we should learn, we Italians. I put myself amongst the Italians, something from which we should learn, and that is this amazing ability, analytical ability, this amazing ability really to break down argument, to understand what is going on, not to be, as it were, impressionistic in giving a judgment of what is going on, this ability really to go down and to see what follows from what, and where the fallacy is and so on. So that's another way in which not only the history of philosophy and philosophy should have this constant conversation, but also the continental tradition, which is more steeped in the history of philosophy, and the Anglo-American tradition, which is which teaches us how to extract significance, relevance, how to really understand what is going on in arguments and so on. So thank you for that example, Stefano. As a singer,
only remark. I agree with the importance of this mixing of two traditions, and my impression, I don't know what the colleagues think about, or maybe I know, but my impression is that in Italy also, in our tradition now, the problem is not, or no longer the danger of antiquarianism, but maybe the danger is more to lose what was good in our tradition. I mean, the capacity of reading a text, reading historically, and so on. These skills that you are saying would be so important, no?
Well, that would be a terrible shame if trying to imitate what the Anglo-American are doing, we were to lose what is unique to us, and which really, as it were, offers something that the Anglo-American system just doesn't have, because I mean, even people who come to Oxford to study classics, knowing Latin and Greek is not a prerequisite. And of course, you can then start from scratch, but, well, unless you are really there is something there which has not yet taken hold the way in which it takes hold in other educational systems. And that is why then you find that so many people who are in the profession in ancient philosophy are Italian, German. There is something which this tells us. But if we were to lose what is really precious in our educational system because we want just to imitate something else, that is definitely not a winning move, I think. We should be learning without losing the unicity of what we have. And I see that myself. For instance, in the US, sometimes you get some new philosopher. These are papers on Leibniz in which you can see from 1 mile away that it has all been done in English. There was never a moment in which they read either the Latin or the French. And that shows because certain things are just, obviously, any translation is an interpretation. So they come already having filtered everything in another way. And then one has got to admire the clarity, the ability to analyze this argument. And I, for one, admire that. But it's starting from a basis which is already no longer really Leibniz. And yeah, I have seen a PhD thesis on Kant where clearly the person these people don't read any German, and not even to the point of, well, maybe you couldn't just take the Critique of Pure Reason and start reading in German, but at least comparing the English translation with the original. All that seems to be superfluous. And I think that shows in the quality, maybe not of the argumentation, but in the quality of really getting to grip we can't, or Leibniz.
Yeah.
So I think we should not slide into that, taken by a urge to get better at the other things. Okay, I agree with Stefano's observation. Oh, there is, no, that was fingers from, let me read, Niccolò here. Can I read for a moment Roberto's comment in the chat? I have no particular questions, but thank you for representation of the study of the history of philosophy as an antidote to dogmatism and traditionalism in the study of philosophy. To return to Leibniz, have you found any thematization in Leibniz works of the problem of the history of philosophy? Ah, that is a good question. I would bet anything that there is, but it has not been properly investigated. Well, I have written myself the chapter on Leibniz as historian in the Oxford Handbook of Leibniz out of sheer desperation, because I couldn't find anybody who was working on that. So my view is that there is a huge mine still to be mined, and I think that I would expect one would find also relevant things about the history of philosophy. But yeah, I am not aware that it has been studied. And of course, as we know, the historical writings of Leibniz, I believe the series now has been started, but there is not yet volumes. So I think that is a huge body of material about history, philosophy of history, historiography, and I take also history of philosophy, which has not been mined. The most extensive study I have found is a very good doctoral thesis in French at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think there is a wonderful research project for somebody.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria Rosa, because it's very clear the method of history of Leibniz, but I have not found any thematization about this method. No? And then it's very clear the relationships with the ancient philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, and so on, but the thematization of the method I have not found. No? That's
yeah, no, me too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Nicolò, I see your hand.
So, Maria Rosa, thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to react and say something, but I had just a compliment, a little observation and a curiosity, let us say so. So the compliment is that I'm very happy to have attended your talk, because your paper has been very important for me as a historian of science and mathematics. I have an interest for the historiography of mathematics and science somewhat, and so your paper was very interesting. I'm happy that you are developing these ideas. Very happy about that, and I find your position very convincing indeed. The little observation is that for a historian of mathematics, well, something of what you say is very useful, and it is very interesting to see what cannot be transferred to the history of mathematics. For example, it is difficult for me to think that what is last is not necessarily best in science or mathematics. So if you go to the dentist, you hope that they will use the latest technology, not what was found 3 years ago, but what is up to date. Yes. So, but also in the case of mathematics or science, looking back can be interesting from the viewpoint that you take as a historian of philosophy. Philosophy, is a discipline that has a strong stability in a way. I mean, your idea that there are basic questions that structure the history of philosophy, even though philosophers are situated and we have to contextualize them in order to understand exactly what the cogency of the arguments. So that's very convincing. I find that also as a historian of science, I always have this problem of striking a balance between, between continuity and distance from the text, between foreignizing and familiarizing the text, so to speak. So it's there is a lot of what you say that resonates with my craft, so to speak. But the curiosity is the following: rather than moving chronologically, if we move geographically, so to speak, and we move to Chinese or Indian philosophy, something like that, have you tried to apply your ideas about the stability and the continuity of philosophical problems when you confront yourself with different cultures? You know, I have in mind also, you know, philosophers of African philosophy who claim that it is impossible to translate Aristotle into some of the sub-Saharan languages. So, I would like you to comment about this. You know, it's a curiosity that I have. So
yeah, well, it's a curiosity which actually is becoming more and more a big thing, because where I am now is becoming more and more commonplace that we should open up the curriculum to other traditions, and that therefore we should make space for Indian philosophy. Islamic philosophy is different because, of course, if you go into Averroes and Avicenna, that is the same conversation. But if you go to Chinese philosophy, which is earlier than the medieval philosophy and so on, then really you find a different conversation. I think here is another case in which one should keep together the two aspects, the commonality and the difference, because there will be genuine difference, genuine different ways of thinking about things, of approaching the whole issue of being or whatever, which are genuinely different. And I think we should respect that as different and not try to, as it were, colonize it by showing that it is the same, because it is part of what I was trying to say diachronically rather than geographically, that sometimes authors in the past genuinely think in ways which are different from the way in which you think, and may alert us to a fully different way to approach things that it never would have occurred if we stayed in our worldview. And if anything, that is even more acute as a different worldview. At the same time, what I am finding, just attending papers by others in this tradition, is that in certain respect, we all share human nature, and we all come back to certain issues. What is ultimately real? This is a question which comes across all that, and to me is in many ways the fundamental question of metaphysics. What is ultimately real? And then we can expand our, as it were, toolkit by asking also other traditions which may have approached that in a completely different way. But the big question is there. And that is something which strikes me attending papers in ancient Indian philosophy, classic Chinese philosophy, the question of what we call the soul, they might call it somewhere else, whether everything is one, whether there are individuals or not. These questions come across, I think. But thank you, that is a wonderful thing. And I didn't say it before because I didn't want to say something too controversial, especially when there are such great historians of science in the audience, that there is a way in which the history of philosophy is sui generis, and in that is different from the history of mathematics or the history of science. There is a sort of stability there, as you put it very nicely, which is sui generis.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I think I think it emerged very clearly from your talk. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. I think Stefano, I know he has a lecture, So that is why we bracket.
No,
we don't.
No.
So, other questions or fingers? I think we have exhausted that, so perfectly, really pre-established harmony between this seminar and the amount of questions and the start of other things in the afternoon. So I hope this is not a goodbye, but arrivederci in September, because yes, I would really, as it were, treasure the opportunity to discuss my draft, the draft of this book with the Milan crowd.
It's an amazing research project, Maria Rosa. Thank you so much for being with us. Look forward to seeing you in September.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. And I look forward to meeting you here in Milan because we have several points to discuss. Thank you.
Yes, I remind for all people that Maria Rosa will come again, and this time we hope in person in Milan in the second half of September. And in that occasion, she will discuss with us her ongoing project on belief.
Knowledge and belief, traditional conception of knowledge and belief.
Knowledge and belief.
And how they can contribute to present-day discussion on epistemology.
Yeah. Right. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to you and thank you to Diana for inviting me. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me, and I truly enjoyed these seminars and this paper today, despite being virtual. I have to say I enjoyed it more than I expected. So thank you to all.
A settembre. Ciao.
A settembre.
See you in September.
Bye.
A Milano.
A Milano. Ciao.
Ciao, grazie. Grazie di essere venuta.